morning everyone, this is Mo and this is Canada 902. Today I'm doing a tour with the first year tourism management students, and we're gonna tour the downtown Halifax, Nova Scotia, and we're gonna go to visit the graveyard of the greatest tragedy in humankind. We're gonna visit the graveyard of the Titanic, where most of the bodies they were able to take from the ocean, buried in here in Nova Scotia and Halifax. So there will be a tour guide talking about the whole truth story about the Titanic and how it sank and how many people they managed to take from the ocean and bury them there, and the true love story between Roz and Jack. So stay tuned, see you in a bit.
My name is David Cunningham, and on behalf of Atlantic Tours, welcome to this tour of the City Tour of Halifax. I've been a tour guide since my 4th summer here, so I do tour guide tours in French and in English and do lots of city tours. And you can imagine why. I want you to think about why people come to Halifax. Why do they come to visit this city? What's the point of coming to Halifax? What's of interest to tourists here? So you're going to discover some of those things today, why people come from around the world to this city to see this city.
Grave. Here we see the Upham family here. The mother, Jenny, 42. Her sons, Everett, 17, and Lewis, age 9, killed in the Halifax explosion. In these graveyards and all graveyards of Halifax, you will find hundreds of such graves. With 2,000 people killed, some bearing the names of entire family members as well. Above us here in the cemetery, there's a stone that marks the grave of 100 unidentified victims. Because so many people were killed, there was no one left to identify the victims. They're buried anonymously in a marked grave up here. West End Cemetery is the same thing just over here. So you'll notice coming in here, if you look in the cemetery, it doesn't take long to find the Halifax explosion graves in here. The Titanic Cemetery here in Halifax. It's unique in the world. There are 121 victims buried here. Notice how the gravestones are in 4 rows and sweep up to a point. There's a rounded part over there for the bow of the ship. Now if you're going to right that ship, the bow points pretty much towards the north. As it turns out, the bow of the wreck of the Titanic below the sea points in the same direction as this cemetery does as well. A bit of folklore there. This is the size of the tombstone the White Star Line agreed to pay for. If the tombstones are any larger or more elaborate, it's because families or other people contributed the money to do so. They agreed to pay for stones that size, and we believe the granite came from New Brunswick. We're thinking it came from New Brunswick. The date of death is April the 15th. The Titanic struck an iceberg before midnight our time, but sank after midnight. Presumed everybody perished on April the 15th. Every gravestone has a unique number. See that? The local coroner here, Dr. John Barnstead, devised a system of keeping track of the bodies. He had every body numbered as it came out of the sea, took their possessions and put it in a bag with the same number, and he wrote up coroner's reports with the same numbers. That information exists today, to this day, at the public archives. You can access that information and see it down there at the public archives and here in Halifax. So he linked all the information together in hopes of identifying people after the burials here in Halifax. So every grave has that number for that reason. If they knew the identity of the person at the time of burial in 1912, it's on the top of the tombstone. If there's no name at all on the tombstone, like here, it's because this person has never been identified and likely never will be. There are about 40 victims buried in Halifax that have never been identified. However, if the name appears on the front of the tombstone, like Venda Heinen here, and Jenny Henriksen up here, and Mr. Cox over there, because they were identified later on. In fact, those 3 were identified in 1991 by the Titanic Historic Society. Right? They went back over the passenger list. Now, of 1,500 victims, only about 115 were women, because women had priority for lifeboats. Jenny Henriksen was the only woman missing with the initials JH. So going over the passenger list, it was logical it must be her. She had the initials J sewn in all of her clothing. So they concluded it must be her there. It seems obvious now, but it wasn't in 1912 for some reason. Venda Heinen had finished money and and her initials in her clothing as well. So she was identified in 1991 as well. So other than that, the only hope to identify victims would be through DNA testing, which they did some in 1998. But after opening these graves, this is one mass grave here, and they were buried in literally pine boxes, the victims here. And with an underground stream in the cemetery down this hill, and the acidic soil we have here, there's absolutely nothing left under there. Nothing used for DNA purposes, with one exception, top of the hill up there. And I'll tell you why it's true. Because on board the Titanic that night was a lady from Halifax, a Haligonian. Her name was Hilda Slater. She was returning from France back to Halifax. She was an aspiring opera singer and had gone to France to ply her trade and discovered she really wasn't all that good. So she quit opera and was coming back home to get married. And her trousseau was on the Titanic, went to the bottom of the sea. But she didn't. Being a lady, she got a place in the lifeboat. And it was very calm that night. So when she was sitting in the calm water, she testified later on that she could still hear the orchestra playing music even as the Titanic slipped below the surface of the water. So those men continued to play music to calm the passengers, sacrifice themselves to calm the passengers, give them a chance to get off the ship. So John Hume was the first violinist. I always stopped to salute his grave for his courage and his self-sacrifice. At the Catholic cemetery, you'll find the grave of Fred Clark, the bassist. The band's leader, Wallace Hartley, his body was recovered as well, but was taken back to England by his fiancée, and his violin was recovered, was strapped to his body. It's in a museum in England to this day. John Hume had a fiancée as well. She was pregnant at that time. That was kind of frowned upon. And she wanted the proceeds from their his life insurance policy, but so did his father. So they went to court for a battle. Eventually she won the proceeds for her and their child. He had also rented a tuxedo for the trip. His father got a bill for his tuxedo. And but he said, if you want it, go get it. Right? He wasn't going to pay it. Hey, welcome to the top of the cemetery here. This is the most popular grave in the cemetery. It belongs to what's called the unknown child of the Titanic. And I described him a little bit to you earlier by St. George's Anglican Church. The crew of the Mackie Bennett recovered his body. It was the fourth body taken from the sea. And they were completely heartbroken. They did not expect to find any children's bodies. They thought all children had been rescued. But of 112 children on board the Titanic, half of them perished, 56 perished. And they only found one child's body, this little boy's body. Now curiously, after 6 days in the sea, and him not wearing any life jacket, being fully clothed with a pair of little leather shoes, his body was still floating on the sea. And nobody knows why that is. It's almost like a miracle. It's almost like he was destined to be identified at some point. So, when they buried that boy, the crew of the Mackie Bennett paid for this tombstone. They put their money together, paid for a beautiful casket, wagon loads of flowers, and they held an elaborate funeral for him in Halifax, St. George's Round Church. And with thousands of people behind them, they marched all the way out here to bury this boy in the cemetery. They also put a chain around his neck with a copper plaque with the words, "Our Babe." They didn't know who the boy was at that time, so they simply adopted him as Our Babe, and they buried him here in the cemetery. So he lay here for many, many years. When I was a boy, we'd bicycle out to the cemetery to visit this graveyard, to look at explosion graves and the Titanic graves. We never dreamed we'd ever know who this boy is. And everybody here assumed, and on those panels it says so, that he must be the son of this boy, of this woman. Alma Paulson was a young Swedish mother traveling with her 4 children, going to meet her husband Nils Paulson in New York. He had gone ahead of the family to save money to bring them over. Unfortunately, they were in 3rd class in the Titanic and they all perished in the sinking. Alma and her 4 children, including her little boy, Costa Paulson. So it was assumed for many years this must be Costa Paulson, who lay near his mother. So the Paulson family in 1998 requested that DNA testing be carried out here to try to identify, see if this boy was one of the Paulsons. And so a project was put together by Dr. Ryan Parr at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, and Alan Ruffman, a local historian, to do some DNA testing. And they exhumed the graves down below here, there was nothing left. When they exhumed this grave, because he's at the top of the hill, and because he had the copper plaque around his neck, the words "Our Babe" on it, they found pieces of finger bone and 3 teeth. So with that, they were able to do DNA testing around the world to see who this might be. Right away, they ruled out Costa Paulson. It's not Costa Paulson who lay here. With initial testing, they identified a Finnish boy, Aino Panula, in Finland. The Panula family was on board the ship Maria and her 4 children, going to meet her husband in New York. They all perished as well. And they initially had a positive result that this would be Aino Panula. And if you go to YouTube and look for the unknown child of the Titanic, you'll see a full documentary that concludes that it's Aino Panula who lies here. But they were wrong. With subsequent, more detailed testing, they discovered they had a false positive. A false positive. So there was a lot of heartbreak around that time. Right around that time, a little miracle happened. A man showed up in Halifax with a little pair of leather shoes. He said, these are the leather shoes the little boy was wearing. His grandfather, Sergeant Clarence Northover, was charged with burning the clothing of the Titanic victims. He didn't want souvenir hawkers getting them and selling them as macabre souvenirs. So his job was to burn the clothing. When it came time to burn the little leather shoes of this boy, he didn't do it. He kept the shoes. And he moved to Ontario. Eventually he sent his grandson, Earl Northover, here to bring those shoes to the Maritimes and the Atlantic, where they are today, to this very day. So those shoes showed up at that time, and forensic investigations indicated they were British in style. Mary Janes, they're called, for little children that would wear, boys and girls. So they went back to the passenger lists and started testing the Goodwin family. Now the Goodwin family, the father and the mother of 6 children, were all in 3rd class in the Titanic. They all perished in the sinking. Could this be the youngest child in that family, Sidney Goodwin? And after some very good testing in the end, and after almost 100 years, they finally determined the boy who lies here is indeed Sidney Goodwin of the Goodwin family. So the boy who lies here is this boy, Sidney Leslie Goodwin of the Goodwin family, who perished in the Titanic sinking. And we know today at least who he is. And you can see his shoes, his leather shoes, at the Maritimes in the Atlantic. They didn't want to change this tombstone here, paid for by the Mackie Bennett, so they added a plaque at the bottom here. He was about 18 months old at that time. So he was the only child's body recovered in the sinking of the Titanic. Now the Goodwins were not supposed to be on the Titanic. They had 2nd class tickets on the SS New Yorker, but there was a coal strike at that time in England, and therefore the White Star Line transferred coal and passengers from other ships. So they ended up in 3rd class in the Titanic for that reason. But Mr. Goodwin was not complaining. He wrote a postcard home and said, 3rd class in the Titanic is better than 2nd class in other ships anyway, and we're going to save some money, so it's not so bad in the end. But they all perished in the sinking anyway. Are there any questions at this point in time? Most of you are too young to remember maybe the film Titanic came out in 1997. Oh, sorry about that. Anyway, 1997, James Cameron came to Halifax to research this movie Titanic. The swashbuckling hero of the movie, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, was Jack Dawson. Jack Dawson. So once this movie came out, we had lots of young ladies coming to this grave to lament at the grave of Jack Dawson. In fact, the grass didn't grow here for a couple of years, okay? But we didn't tell them the truth, because why would you do that? They were spending good money in Halifax, okay? And it's like telling the truth with the Loch Ness Monster. Why would you do that, right? Then there's no fun anymore. However, this is not the grave of Jack Dawson. The man who lies here is Joseph Dawson, and he's one of the amazingly heroic crew members of the Titanic. Joseph Dawson and 324 other men, primarily from Southampton in England, spent 24 hours a day shoveling coal into the giant boilers of the ship. That was their job. He was a coal trimmer. Now, when the Titanic struck the iceberg, the first 4 compartments were filled with water. And the ship's architect, Thomas Andrews, was with Captain Smith. And Andrews said, if we can keep compartment number 5 dry, she won't sink. So Smith sent an order down to Dawson and the other men. He said, keep compartment 5 dry. And they said, we can't. It's filling up. So Andrews said, if number 5 fills, she's gone. She's going to sink. And indeed, the Titanic sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Okay? Once those compartments started filling up, it was over. Andrews said she's going to sink. So Smith sent another order down to Dawson and the men down below. He said, stay at your posts. Keep the engines going. We need electricity to keep the lights on to get the passengers off the ship. And we know he stayed at his post because all 325 of those men perished in the sinking. And only Dawson's body was found. So those brave men stayed at their post to help the passengers. And we know the lights were still on the Titanic even as she slipped below the surface, because Hilda Slater, the lady I told you about, testified to that fact later on. So I always stop to salute the grave of Joseph Dawson here and the 324 other men from Southampton in England. There's a big memorial there to them for staying at their posts to try to help the passengers in the Titanic. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. So it's Joseph Dawson.
That was the story of the Titanic, and as the tour guide said, the love story between Jack and Rose, it's mostly fictional, just to make the movie more interesting. So there's no love story, and others say that the love story is actually between a man and a woman who are 50 to 60 years old, and he's the one who sacrificed his life to change or to save Rose's life, and he was 50 years old or 60 years old, I can't remember, but this tour guide says that it's all fictional.